Thanks a lot. Good. Well, welcome everybody to indeed the final block of this two-day workshop. To me personally, I found it quite inspirational. So I hope that everybody after this session goes home with even more energy and insights. This is the final panel that we'll do today, which is about landscape scale investments. And I'll briefly introduce my panelists. Next to me is sitting Paul from the Landscape Finance Lab. We have Fernando from Meraki Capital. We have Pierre, former BNP. He helped shape the TLFF, and today he's an advisor on quite innovative investment projects. We have Liliana from South Pole, and we have Gaurav from UN Environment. So quite a number of experts here on stage. This session is about a landscape approach, and I think that's a term that many must have heard the past years. I joined IDH about 8 years ago when this landscape approach was emerging. I work with IDH, Sustainable Trade Initiative, an NGO in the Netherlands. And when I started reading about a landscape approach, this immediately sounded to me like this is a really appealing solution for combining the interests of farmers, biodiversity, people, local communities into coherent development plans. Now, I come from a region in the Netherlands called Waterland, which, as the name already implies, it's called Waterland. It's a place with a lot of water and a lot of peat. And this is also a region where historically, local people, homeowners, farmers, friends of biodiversity, have always needed to work together to come up with sustainable management plans. And this is, of course, what a landscape approach wants to do, to build coalitions of people around the joint vision, around land use and water management in a region, build sustainable business models around that, and then attract investment to make them a reality. Today I had the landscape finance team within IDH, which is also a team that works in the landscapes where IDH works to attract sustainable capital into such innovations. So coincidentally, that's also the topic of today's panel, landscape scale investments. Now, to dive straight in, landscape scale investments probably mean a lot more than only carbon finance, because there's also always capital needed to invest in a sustainable agriculture transition, to invest in other activities that enable local communities to have a sustainable income out of the landscape. Paul, what challenges, when you have worked on landscape finance as the head of the Landscape Finance Lab in the past years, do you run into when you think about landscape scale investments?
Oh, wow.
Is that too much of it?
Yeah. There's lots of challenges, as you can imagine, and different in every landscape. I think one of the wonderful things that's happened in the last decade is the landscape side of it. We've got that sorted. The finance is less clear, but I think we're getting a pretty good understanding of how to do landscapes. And in fact, you and I worked together many years ago in co-authoring the Little Sustainable Landscape book, which was launched at the Paris Climate COP. And that gives a 5-step methodology. Just bring everyone together and then go through the project cycle, and you have your landscape plan. And there's a really important additional step to that now, the PPI, Protect, Produce, Include methodology of IDH, which is very similar to the 3 zones. In your landscape, you need a natural area, you need a production area, and somewhere in between. You need to manage the regeneration in between those. So the 3 zones, PPI, 5 elements, are a core way of managing this. And if you do that, you get 4 returns. You get an ecological return, a social return, an economic return, and most importantly, the return of inspiration. That's something I'm realizing is more and more powerful about these landscapes. People can feel attached to the idea of bringing tigers back into the jungles of Cambodia, restoring the reefs of Fiji, bringing back the peatlands of northern Scotland. They're all the projects, or Liberia, smallholder production and forest restoration in Liberia. So the landscape side is coming together quite nicely, and I'd encourage you to look at the Little Sustainable Landscape book, the 4 returns framework, and PPI. when we started, there were 80 definitions of the landscape approach. I think that's where we are with finance, the finance world. We've got 80 different models for how to do finance. Having a discussion about how to bring those together into a much simpler mechanism is what we need to have now. We've got some fantastic examples. The Tropical Landscape Finance Facility in Jambi is a very clear, structured investment program for sustainable rubber and forest protection, $210 million. And there's carbon investment in the Congo. We helped develop a $170 million program for an area the size of Greece in Democratic Republic of Congo. You'd think that would fall over in a day, but it's lasted 10 years so far. But how do we bring all of these models together in a much simpler mechanism, so that we can really, so bankers can deal with simplicity rather than complexity? I think that's our challenge. That's enough. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Paul. And I think that's a nice highlight that you put on the inspirational capital. Because I think, after all, that's why we're all in the room today, right? We want to achieve something bigger than what you would be able to do by yourself. Thinking about this investment in landscapes, I think what you highlighted is a challenge on who are you going to invest into? Where are these say, bankable operators or actors on the ground that can combine green ambitions with boots on the ground to make them work? And I'm happy to have you in the room, Fernando, because you manage an investment fund and you eventually decided into becoming a project developer yourself as an organization. So it'd be great to hear some reflections from you from Brazil on that.
Yeah, so for me it was quite a journey. I used to be only managing my fund from the Netherlands, looking for investment funds with boots on the ground, especially in Latin America, building a portfolio around funds. And then I really realized, like, the most exciting projects, they were far from being investment ready for these funds to invest.
Yeah.
And then I really decided to go in, being a Brazilian and knowing developers on the field, and then start our own projects. And it was really interesting. We went to a region in Mato Grosso, where IDH is really very present too, but we're more west to the state. This is cattle ranching at its core, and we wanted to move this cattle ranching to some type of agroforestry system, looking at alternative proteins. And the first approach we did when we created a design was to come in with cashew nut. And it was a disaster. We were not able to find suppliers of quality seedlings. We had a very high tree mortality. And then we found out that there was this tree we were also considering in the design called the baru nut, which is a local nut. And then it's when we start tapping into the whole landscape approach. So we could not only build a project there to inspire other cattle ranchers to make cattle integrated with agroforestry in silvopasture, but we could also look at a tree with a nut species where we can build a whole new supply chain of a superfood, which is baru, and really help out the smallholder farmers that today they have these nuts on their fields. They don't know really what to do with it. And this ends up as additional feed for the cattle. So now we're building a whole new supply chain around baru nuts, and it's really involving the whole community. So this is how it began, the project.
That's really exciting, I think. I think this is a really interesting initiative. And maybe if you have time still, could you share a bit of your insights around managing such a diversified business? Because I think a lot of us, when we consider investing in agroforestry or in this, it's sometimes challenging to think about how one operator has to then cater to 4, 5, 6 different supply chains.
Yeah, so for me, there were a lot of learnings. First one is that we really need solid local people to operate these projects. At the beginning, we started with many partners, like really high-level partners coming, and some of them promising they could do this from Europe, for instance. And very rapidly, we found out, no, we have to build our own infrastructure. And it's key to have an amazing farm manager who lives in the farm and understands a little bit of agroforestry as well as the old system to make the transition and bring people to be inspired to do the transition. And then it's also a road where we end up having to create a lot of a vertical structure, because the big bottleneck that we found was like labor and also nursery, like buying seedlings. So the difference on tree mortality we had when we started implementing the project in different seasons was immense. And everything went down to the quality of the seedlings we were purchasing. So then we had to build our own nursery and become seedling providers for the whole region to be able to implement this project. So it just goes on and on. It starts getting more complex. And now we're going to also look at processing the baru nuts. Somebody has to step in and create a little industry to process the whole baru in the region. We're going to have to do that as well. So that's a lot of incremental things to the project.
Nice, nice. Great. Well, I think that's an inspiring example, and it also highlights the needs for more project developers with boots on the ground that can pick up on these challenges, right? Because that's what's required. Maybe another reflection on that is saying, well, is the capital available for such project developers to start up? And that's where maybe Gurov, you have some interesting models or innovations that you can share with us.
Sure. Let me start with a story. I worked with WWF in Myanmar for 6 years, where it was a really complex landscape, really complex stakeholders, the ethnic groups, the government. And we tried to bring different stakeholders together to develop a landscape plan. We actually agreed to bring different stakeholders together. Of course, there was a lot of time and energy spent on our side, but then when we approached the investors said it's too high a risk for us, we are not going to go in Myanmar. And that put me in a difficult position with the government and other stakeholders. So to address really this issue, to address this issue and many other issues, we at UNEP, in partnership with UNDP, have been working on a few innovative mechanisms with the objective to unlock investment from institutional investors and make them flow to the landscape based on the landscape approach. So the overall idea is that the stakeholders on the ground work together to develop a landscape approach, an inclusive landscape approach based landscape plan. So where the protected areas are going to be, where the corridors are going to be, where are the communities going, the companies going to source oil palm from, where are the community forests, more spatial planning, but also a conservation plan, what are going to be the expected costs, as well as what are going to be the outcomes in, let's say, 5 years, 10 years, what would be the anticipated emission reduction, what would be the anticipated improvement in your other ecosystem services, and what could be the potential revenue from those. So we have the cost and revenue sorted out on the landscape sides. And then what we aim to do is to combine different landscapes across different countries and set up an SPV, which is not within the jurisdiction of those countries. So it's sitting outside those countries, and have the SPV issue a mix of debt instruments with the objective to bring in public sector financing from DFIs, from bilateral donors, from multilateral donors, to de-risk and crowd in the investment from institutional investors. So the idea is to bring the senior tranche to the investment grade, so institutional investors are able to invest into this. So once you have the investments, bring them to the landscapes, improve the ecosystem services, monetize those ecosystem services, and pay back the investors, and hopefully there will be some leftovers. Establish a local conservation trust fund that can continue to support conservation after 10 or 15 years of duration. So we are looking at 2 innovations at the moment. One is specifically focused on tigers in the tiger range countries in Southeast Asia, and other is focused more in Latin America.
Great. So there's more capital coming our way. So need for more projects.
And if I could also say, if I have mentioned this, if any of you are interested in this, I'll be very happy to discuss further.
Great, thanks. Now, I would assume, of course, that if that capital starts to flow, it doesn't only flow for conservation and ecosystem and forest protection, it also needs to benefit local communities, and business models need to include them in a significant way. And I think here's interesting that we have Pierre on our panel today, because you've been leading the development of a new business model and initiative in South Africa that takes quite a particular view on including local communities and also developing the project with a landscape vision in mind. I think you've also prepared slides for the presentation.
I have
so
some.
maybe we can
I
get
will
them
show
up.
some, but to introduce, first of all, the project is called Terra Green. First of all, it comes from an entrepreneur, so it's a startup. So it's somebody who is thinking about generating a business. And normally, when you have an entrepreneur, the first thing he's thinking about is the return. The first thing those people are thinking about is the natural capital. So they start from the impact. They start from the impact, and this is important because in addition of measuring the risk, which all investors will look at, they will also include what kind of impact they generate, and they will follow that through all the process. So they measure the impact, and then after that, they come to what kind of revenues and profit we will generate after that. So they start from a capital. They start from a capital asset, and they will consider the landscape as an asset. And of course, they didn't buy the land. They lease the land from the community. They put the community as a shareholder of the company. They are starting to build everything with the local community. The piloting, everything is started. They have discussed first with the local people what they wanted to do. And the local people are associated at what they wanted to do. After that, what they asked me to say, and they come, Pierre, you come and you will finance this. And I said, no, you will never finance that. Why? Because, first of all, you need to create a collaborative associate. You have gaps in your project. What about the technical assistant? What about the biodiversity? What about the impact measurement? So we create a community around a community who came, and we have an MOU between a community of people, which is gathering people as gold standard, or we wanted IUCN, we have R20. We have people who have reviewed the business model, and people who knows also the off-takers who are in the business side. So we start to gather a community when you have involved at the same time the off-takers, the government at different level, the central level, the ministry level, the regional level, the local level. And then after that, you have the technician, the scientist, the people who are looking at what we will do exactly. The purpose of what we're talking about is to rehabilitate 200,000 hectares of land which has been destroyed by the mining in Mapulonga in South Africa, giving 50,000 jobs of people who are in the industry today of coal who will move to that industry. So there is a component, the social component, so you had to involve the government to do that. And then after that, you had to put all this together in order to have everybody aligned. And then after that, you think about financing. And quickly, I show you the financing, the way we do that. We start by angel investor. We have convinced people by the business model who came and we put the money to start and to build a team that you needed to have in order to continue the job. Of course, you can imagine the people have put their own money also in addition on that. Then we think about the technical assistance that we need to do. And so we build up with the coalition, we have the technical assistance, we have 260 things to finance through the technical assistance which has been defined, from education to reviewing, surveying, analysis of biodiversity, etc., etc. And then we are working on the most tricky part, which is the transition financing. There is nothing in finance today which is helping to finance transition. So it means that we need to spend 3-5 years to rehabilitate the land without producing anything, except maybe one thing, carbon claims at the end. And this is why here we put in place a concessional loans, which is for people who want to invest, with the carbon as a collateral, but not the carbon credit, the carbon claims as a collateral. And so we will give the opportunity to those people after to convert the loan into equity, if they want to be in the business. The type of investor we have interested by that are corporates who will be off-taker. You remember we already talked to the off-takers potentially. And there are some DFI who follow, and one MDBs, by the way. So they're all interested by that because they see the equity and the opportunity after to enter in the equity. In case we cannot have and it claims carbon, it may happen, We have the chance that it may grow up, maybe with the price, but in case we don't have, then we put a de-risking by a state-owned business. So that means state will cover. You can imagine the country is quite happy. We will rehabilitate the land, so they're quite happy and the risk they take is very minimal because it finally is to cover in case it doesn't get what we normally expect. And after that, you enter in normal financing because you will have equity and then you will have off-takers. So off-takers, you can organize a different kind of bonds. And then after that, it's a question to roll the project. So this is showing about what we have to do sometimes is other things than just trying to cover what doesn't work, but to reinvent the way to do things by putting as front the nature, the biodiversity, designing things that we cannot go across the line, so we cannot do this, and then after that you can develop business. Now I will tell you what will be the component of the business. The business will be to grow 40% to 50% of natural forests, so species that normally has been existing in that, because that place is a savanna today, but it used to be a forest 200 years ago. So to bring back the forest. Then after that, you will have around 30% will be around permaculture and some things that will be used by the local community in order to serve them in vegetables, etc. And the main business that will fund everything, and the business model that is show that is profitable, even before using the carbon. So it's a bamboo, and so it's activities that we will do on bamboo, starting with pellets in order to do the transition, the energy transition with coal, and then 28 activities has been defined to be developed around the bamboo, fiber, manufacturing, and you can imagine many others. Even I discovered recently, even a cream for baby by some cosmetics. So,
Wow.
but what is interesting, what we will do with the carbon, as soon as the people are now the shareholder, we will use the carbon claims to transform them in carbon credit at the end, not at the beginning, to pay the investor, to pay the people who are maintaining the land, and also to pay insurance. We will issue parametric insurance to do protection. And
Yeah.
so we will use the carbon at the end, and the people will receive the credit carbon after they can transform it, or they can do whatever they want but they do it at the end of the process, and it's done for mainly to activate the funding during the catalytic period.
Nice, nice. Well, thanks for that, Pierre. And I think this is also an inspiring example on multiple levels, actually, because it is mobilizing capital to invest in an inclusive way into degraded lands owned by a community and restoring those. But it's also using carbon in quite an untraditional form, right? And letting that accrue as sort of a collateral to the loan. So that's an interesting approach. Thanks.
Just want to say that progressively the communities are getting a higher rate of the ownership of the company. So normally it's planned at the end of the lease, normally the company belongs to them.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you highlighted carbon and the role it plays in the project. Lilian, we also have you on the panel working with South Pole as a carbon expert. And what I was triggered on by the remark of Pierre is that he says, well, we don't monetize this carbon, right? It can be claimed. Now I understand you're working on the landscape approach for South Pole, where you do a similar thing, but then working with cocoa companies who, as part of their net zero, nature positive commitments, want to work through a landscape approach in a cocoa landscape in Colombia and Peru. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about that and the role that carbon finance potentially can play in such an initiative?
Yeah, sure. I want to highlight two big points in our initiatives. The first one is that we try to connect the companies that need to understand the relation with the nature, but at the same time, what is happening underground with the community. So we act like this connection and develop all the things that we are working on a landscape scale. So we think not only in carbon, but also thinking what happening if we include biodiversity and some financial mechanisms, plus payment for ecosystem services related with water. And usually we analyze the landscape scale. What happened, and it's super curious, and in Peru we had one project that we were working with cocoa sector, and When we went to the field, only the 5% of the lands are producers of cocoa. So what happened with the 95%? So for that reason is that you don't need to only think from the corporate side. You need to think from the landscape side. If not, probably even if we do a great job, the companies do a great job, you couldn't get the real impact in this landscape. And the second point that I want to highlight is that every time that we are working and defining what are the activities that needs to be implemented on the ground, need to consider that not all the financial mechanisms apply for all the contexts. And for that reason, it's important to have different vehicles that you could use depending on the context, depending on the area. As you present, you don't have an unique option. And this gives not only the communities, but also the companies different ways to invest in the territories. So for that reason is that we had one project in Colombia, in Maceo, when we are working with cocoa producers, but with cattle ranching at the same time, coffee producers, and we use the certification of land scale from Berra. Even if it's a label, we can taste how this works with carbon credits plus biodiversity credits in the same area. And now it's under implementation, and it's great to see how the community is linked with the initiative and feel part of the project, not only as an external beneficiary of that.
Great. So there's a couple of points there that really spring out. That's the preparatory work that needed to happen on the ground to bring communities together under a landscape vision. Also, of course, the limited impact on cocoa, on land use practices within the wider region. And of course, your diversified approach, saying, well, we don't look only at carbon, but also at biodiversity credits. So that can take quite a bit of time to put all those initiatives together and make them ready for investment, I understand.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is really a long way. We need to go underground and to talk with the communities and to work with them and to define what is the best approach. And even when we will be defining the benefit sharing for the carbon emission reductions, that these will be linked with the activities that we are promoting. So yeah, it's a long way, but I think that we could do that. And as the end is how you connect the different pieces of the puzzle and do a great picture, because if not, could be not sustainable in the time. So yeah, it's like that.
Thanks. Yeah, well, for me that also brings out, I think, the point of view, Pierre, where you say, well, you have different phases of finance and investment in a landscape approach, and it will start with grants, patient capital, angel investors to get that first step moving, right? Yeah, yeah. Well, we've heard from all of our panelists, so we're opening the floor up for questions from the audience to any of us, while of course realizing that this is the final panel between you and whatever you would like to drink after this. Yes. Maybe while you're thinking about a question, are there any questions between our panel that people would like to hear more about from others?
Maybe we can talk about one component, which is time. Time is a very important thing, because time for investor, and you have a lot of issues. You have to realize that today, if you are a bank, you cannot lend money for a long time, more than 7 years today, probably. If you can have more, you're lucky. So time is an issue for that, because you can see that not everybody can put money on the long term. So you need to think about long term. Nature, you need to replant. You can accelerate maybe a little bit because we have technology, data, we have a lot of issues that can help. But you have to replant the plant, and the plant need to grow up, and they will take time. So managing time in project like that is very important. Time for community is also the same thing. You say at the end you have to involve the community, but the community need to learn also, or to take over things which are not part of necessarily the base culture. Even us in the West, it took us 50 years to understand and to change different culture and different revolution. So it's the same for them. So what is important here? There is the time is running because we have to make those change very quickly. But on the other side, there is a lot of constraints, financially speaking, regulatory speaking, which makes that time and need to be managed with a component of emergency on one side, but on the other side, you need also to take the time to make it good and correctly. And I think managing this timing is probably one of the biggest challenge that we need to handle when we have this project of landscape.
Thanks. Paul?
If I can follow on from
Yes,
that,
definitely.
we don't have the time, do we? We're in the poly crisis. Everything's collapsing, so we need to get scale and speed, and we have to go very slowly, as you're saying, to bring the communities on to build this system. What I'm really heartened by, your 3 slides are actually, you could take any landscape investment program and use that methodology. I think you've already given us some inspiration for this, for the finance side of landscape finance and a methodology. And, you know, 2 days ago, I was in Prague at a big EU gathering as part of the Czech presidency to look at how the EU can support landscape approaches. And we came up with 2 things. Methodology and training is essential. Just sharing ideas on how to do this, not necessarily being totally aligned, but sharing and growing together. And the other thing was the catalytic finance. That middle box in your last slide is totally missing, and we've got to find that quickly. People like this man can help us in the early stages, but if we can solve those two problems and think from the ground up, how does this work for every farmer, every villager in these places, which is the real test.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's true also the role of time is important because a lot of the funds, the reason most of the funds cannot assess early stage projects because they have timelines of 10+2, 10+5 years. And like we are not there yet. So although we have invested millions in this project already, like with private family office investors, to get, we are in advanced talks with a fund right now. The puzzle is how can we fit this in an investment period of 10 years? Mm-hmm. And then you're taking a landscape approach, it's 20 years, so it's or 30. So we have crops in our design that we're only going to harvest, if in the case of timber, in 30 years, like high quality timber. Mm. So that's a complexity around financing.
I just, while we are talking about time, many of the financing instruments that have been in discussion and in pilot among several organizations, they have an element of concessional financing. And we know how incredibly hard and time consuming it has been to access the concessional financing. And more often than not, the risk appetite for concessional financing is also becoming less and less. So this is something that I think needs to also be changed, how to get more concessional capital into high risk, because we have to accept that a lot of the areas where incredible biodiversity exists are also very high risk, conflict sensitive areas. So we need to make sure that there are instruments that are available to provide concessional capital in a reasonable, in a fast manner, and which is addressed to consider these high risks.
With the sufficient risk appetite, I think that's what you're teasing out, right? You say there are new blended finance vehicles, but they're still extremely risk averse. So how do we get more concessional capital into this space of emerging project developers with boots on the ground that need to absorb these long timelines before they can reach break even? Yeah.
On this one, I want to make a comment because I think we need to be a little bit more detailed on this. I think if you talk about traditional investor or institutional investor, I agree. If you talk about the public investor who used to work as they used to work, so now, that's true that they are not today ready and there is little catalytic money. There are new people who are coming for catalytic money, corporates. Corporates are coming with, why? Because the corporates have to solve the supply chain problem. And so they need to invest. If they don't invest, they will die. And so we see today more and more corporates who have cash, who are starting to be, if you take an example of one of the circular fund, circular capital, the main investor were corporates, because they understood that they need to solve some issues immediately. So we need to go
around their net zero commitments.
so
that is,
corporates is probably the first people we need to think about in order to engage them, and they will have another reason, is that sometimes they're also the off-taker. And they could be the off-taker either for the goods that you will generate, but also the carbon. So that means you have reason to engage them. The second people is entrepreneur. Angel investor and entrepreneur. We are going on a culture where there is more and more entrepreneurs. Our kids want to be entrepreneurs. We need to redirect them to that, and we need to bring the talent they have by managing data, by using data, by everything that we have seen in the past 2 days, which is their generation, in order to start and to create new businesses like that.
Yeah.
And they will put their money on it, and they will attract money by the talent. So this is we have to look at the catalytic and the other way that the usual suspect that we used to look on the past 10 years, 20 years.
Yeah. I think those are strong pointers. I think
Yeah.
I will go to Liliana, and then I will take the questions from you, Paul, and one or two other questions from the audience, and then we will need to round off.
Yeah, I just want to say that talking about time is now is the time that we can do things, and not only way that the corporates do things. All of us as a person can do things. My son of 5 years old asked me if me and my friends will be saving the planet, and it's really a big responsibility because I think that we can do a lot of things, not only from the organizations that we represent, but also as persons, give signals to the market by products that probably comes from net zero areas or depending on that. So I think that all of us could play a role in this, in doing faster this transition.
Great, that's a strong personal appeal. And I would even like to add to that, not only with what we buy, but also with what we vote.
Yeah.
Questions from the audience? I saw a hand raised here, please.
Yes, Pierre, very interesting your model and which is of course very common in our sector, that you have a blended finance and you have a combination of concessional funding and then a more senior funding. I think what may also help in this process is that we just go not only stepwise without knowing where we're heading to. What I mean here is that concessional funding is nice, but if we do not pre-agree on the roadmap and what we want to achieve with that concessional funding in the coming 1 or 2 years, where are we heading to? So in other words, we do it to get that more senior funding. And I think that is also a message to DFIs that we have to be a bit more clearer to each other, not dancing around the table that yes, maybe if the music is nice after 2 years we will step in. I think we cannot afford that. So my message is here, we must have a very clear roadmap with requirements, also for concessional funding, because otherwise we cannot take the next step.
Yeah, I fully agree. Yep.
Yeah. Maybe we have people from DFIs in the audience that can reflect on this. People from DFIs that say, well, we don't commit to a project right now, but we're committing to investing in it 2 years from now, or we don't do that for specific reasons. Anybody brave enough to raise their hands on this?
The question I have is why do the DFIs continue to receive pension fund money and monies that otherwise can be allocated to projects? I don't understand why we keep pumping money into the DFIs that take so long to do very little, in my view.
Oh, I think now it's going to be even more difficult for somebody from a DFI to raise their hand.
I think today I will not make any. There are people moving at a different speed today, and to be honest with you, there are DFIs who are all different. I work with several of them, and they are all working at a different path, and with different model. So I think it's evolving. Same from the MDBs. You have MDBs doing different things and different. So there is sometimes the people need also to adapt to who are the stakeholder and what they're working. Forget the people have a stakeholder, so it's the stakeholder that we do need to change maybe the direction that they would like the institution to continue. But we can see today that we cannot generalize anymore. I think there is a lot of, it's really the group of people that you create around the project, and you see the involvement and the trust that you create around the project between people. And this is what makes the project going forward, and having the commitment that normally you should expect, and not necessarily to dance around a future that everybody wants better.
I can add something. In my previous life, I was an investment manager at pension fund, and we offered to FMO to become a cornerstone investor in one of their funds, but other pension funds wouldn't join us. So why we would invest in FMO? Because they have the network on the ground. Because we only come out of bed if the ticket is 100 million euros or 200 million euros, etc. And we don't have the network for direct investments. So at that time, we were willing to put 100 million on the table, but the others were not willing to follow. So we want to give a cornerstone investment, but you need to have more cuts in the room for making the next step. And FMO has a great network, and the private equity returns are also great. So we trusted our money to them, but only if others also would be in place, because we were a small pension fund.
Okay. Well, that's an answer to the question then, from the pension fund investment into the DFIs and from there to the projects related to the size.
I think that's an interesting point too, and it's a big issue that I face in my projects. I go talk with the DFIs, they say, look, the minimum ticket we're willing to do is 20 million. And there's no way I'm gonna get 20 million right now to pump in a project that is early stage. First, I need 1 million. I need to prove my design. I need to plant the first 50 hectares, measure what's going on. Because one thing we know for sure when we're going to implement a project, that our design is wrong. We always know that. So people claim you can do agroforestry designs only using softwares, and that's bullshit. Like when nature doesn't work like that, we know they're gonna plant, they're gonna do really well, others are not gonna do well, we're gonna have to adjust this design. So I only want to receive a check from a DFI once I have nailed my design. But to nail my design, first I need someone to come and give me a 1 million check. So that's the problem.
Great. Well, I think we've heard a lot of reality-informed stories today around getting landscape investments to scale. And some of the things that stand out to me is the need for these boots on the ground, working through agroforestry models and getting them to work. The timelines involved around engaging, especially with local communities, but also other stakeholders in the landscape, to develop inclusive plans about how their land is to be used. And then finally, I think the big thing that stands out is the need for diverse financing modalities. The need for more concessional financing, the need for smaller ticket sizes, more patient capital. So many of these elements jump out at us today. And I think this is something that we can all take at heart and that we can take home, because we have now a deeper understanding of what the reality requires from us to work on. So let us think about that, and let us think all about the role that we can play as individuals in working towards these changes. I'd like to thank you all for joining the panel, and herewith also like to thank all of my panelists and hand over to the organizing committee.